We're going to start a quick video today because maybe, as some of you already know, there's a whole bunch of panic over in the reptile hobby about the US light bulb bans and all this other good stuff. Now, previously, most of the reptile lighting supply companies, including Arcadia, thought that they were going to be able to skate right by because they believed their light bulbs to be general use. If you didn't know, most of these light bulbs, these halogens, things like that that come from Arcadia are actually repurposed light bulbs. They go and they grab light bulbs that were meant for lighting underneath a cupboard or above a sink or something like that. They realize they're halogens, they slap them in a new box, and they call them innovative. Sure, you could say they're innovative to the reptile hobby, but people have been using halogens for a really long time, and slapping and reusing something in a brand new box is silly. On top of that, a lot of people just don't know about these halogen light bulbs, and halogen light bulbs are known for throwing unregulated ultraviolet light, so UV light. Not enough to actually do anything useful with our reptiles, but enough to definitely cause some damage to organisms. In fact, one of the reasons that people stopped using halogen lights in their house was because of the unregulated UV, and things were quoted like early onset aging, etc., etc. So already we know that halogen light bulbs were phased out for use with humans for all sorts of issues. On top of that, and just to be clear, so over in like Europe and Canada and some of these other places, if you look on the package, you will actually see halogen lamps that say UV free. So those halogen bulbs are what they call doped, and you can definitely find them over here too. Normally, if you see the halogen bulb and it's got like a little blue color at the end or something like that, that has been doped to reduce the amount of UV. Once again, other countries label these as UV free. You probably didn't see that in the US, but it is definitely a thing and you can go look it up. So if you doubt when I tell you that halogen lamps emit UV, this is a fact that is 100% confirmed all through science and all through the lighting industry, except for inside of the reptile hobby, which is pretty funny. Now, if you look at the versions of the halogen lamps that Arcadia sells that has, a plastic cover on the front, that also reduces the amount of UV, mind you, unregulated UV. So that's not quite as bad. But anyway, back to the point. These bulbs are just reused from some other source. They get them cheap from some warehouse, they throw them in their own warehouse, they slap a box on them, and then they say that these are innovative. The story with the DHP is the exact same. So when it comes to reptile bulbs, they are not specialty per se. They are identical to what you would go get from an IKEA a few years ago, or from a Lowe's or a Home Depot or whatever. These are generic light bulbs in a fancy little box with a whole bunch of effort to create marketing behind them. Remember, Arcadia is a lighting company, not a veterinary service or animal science or anything like that. Literally a lighting company reusing lamps. So they thought they were going to skate by, but recently ZoomEd has actually gotten a letter that says that their bulbs are not specialty use. And assuming that the same thing is going to be applied across the reptile hobby, that means a lot of companies are going to find out that their light bulbs are actually falling into the phase out of incandescent and fluorescent light bulbs. Arguably, the fluorescent light bulbs, since they emit UV, would technically count as something like specialty use, possibly. But again, this is just generic lighting. And remember, we have had safe and useful alternatives to all of these things for years. Anybody keeping up with the reptile hobby, of course, knows that there was a lot of companies that were producing things like the radiant heat panels. Now, these are arguably, the efficiency is probably roughly the same. However, these are a bit safer. Because you don't have, a several hundred degree halogen lamp really close to your animals. But also, they are based on the flex watt tape. So inside of this thing, you'll find a resistive heat element, which is not that far from a light bulb. Now, if we wanted to go ahead and innovate these products, there are different sorts of material that we could make these out of to match the same wavelengths that are emitted by something like a halogen bulb. In other animal science industries, there are things like gas heaters, quartz heaters, all sorts of different things that are able to warm these animals. If you go and look over at something like baby chickens or something like that, you'll see what would be a heat panel that's also used to warm these animals. So we have had alternatives to halogen bulbs for decades, possibly. I'm not sure exactly when the radiant heat panels came out, but surely other animal science industries have used alternatives to halogen bulbs. Surely. And again, you can go look this up. This is factual information, regardless of what somebody like John Courtney Smith, who works at the lighting company Arcadia, is going to tell you. We absolutely have alternatives to these things. To give you an idea why the alternatives are so important is because incandescent bulbs are extremely energy efficient. The same thing applies to fluorescent. In fact, this isn't the first light bulb ban per se. When fluorescent light bulbs hit a peak of manufacturing, they were actually installed across the country, and there was an initiative to replace all of the halogen bulbs with fluorescents. This is why you more than likely had fluorescents in places like schools, colleges, and department stores, things like that, is because they were more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs. So this isn't the first light bulb ban that we're facing as this rolled out to several different countries with fluorescent lamps. Incandescent bulbs and fluorescent lamps are shown to be extremely inefficient. Not only that, but as mentioned on this channel before, fluorescent lamps actually contain mercury and other hazardous substances that are going to end up in the groundwater, killing the very snakes that people claim that they are trying to move forward with conservation efforts with. So it's a circle that doesn't really make any sense. We should celebrate the idea that the reptile hobby is being pressured into actually removing these bulbs and this toxic material. But in the general reptile hobby fashion, instead, people are claiming, oh, the hobby's not ready for this. There's no alternatives. This is, the government's way of trying to prevent people from keeping reptiles. And all of that is clear fear, uncertainty, doubt, and just ridiculousness. You can still use FlexWatt tape. You can still use silicone heat mats. Now, real quick, somebody's going to lose it because I mentioned silicone heat mats. But these things are safe in every other industry except for reptile keeping, which is very strange. Silicone heat mats are even used in nurseries with humans, and we don't have to worry about babies exploding or becoming on fire. If you were to properly use one of these mats, then you won't really have too many issues. Now, of course, somebody else is going to say, well, they don't emit the same wavelength. Once again, there are different ways to produce different sorts of wavelengths with something like heat. There's all sorts of debate and people trying to do, armchair physics on whether or not something can emit UV, or sorry, not UV, but IRB or IRA or IRC and all these different designations. When realistically, most of these industries will reference this as near UV and far UV. The whole IRA, B, C kind of usage is pretty light, and it's definitely something that Arcadia and stuff use for branding. So these specific mats are more than likely not going to produce the same wavelengths as a halogen ever. However, they can be efficient in warming a terrarium. And then if you also want to provide sources of infrared along those spectrums, then there are plenty of devices that can absolutely do that based on the materials that they use that are not incandescent bulbs. If you do a quick Google for something like infrared heat therapy, you will find all sorts of different little new age nonsensical lamps that provide the same wavelengths and more than likely use less power. Now, I mentioned we need to pressure the providers of reptile equipment in order to shift over to something like producing these heat panels with the correct materials to be able to get to a place that we are with the halogen bulbs. These are probably not that efficient. However, again, the reason the bulbs are getting removed is because they are completely inefficient and are not useful for general lighting. We don't necessarily need light with our heat for reptiles. A lot of people use something like this along with LEDs. LEDs are extremely energy efficient and are far better to use when it comes to the pressure of actually keeping. And we'll get to the pressure of keeping in just a moment. As you know, several different companies have come out with something like the LED UV. Now, not only, here's the double whammy of LED UV. Not only are these more energy efficient to operate every day, but they also last longer. So some people have gone ahead and done some armchair style reviews of these things, and they say that they last for at least 2 years. That is 4 times the amount of time that it's recommended to use some of these fluorescent lamps. 4 times. And so that turns around and says, not only is it cheaper for you to operate, but it's cheaper for you to initially purchase. And there's less waste because you are not replacing these things nearly as often as you would a fluorescent lamp. The reptile hobby is prepared to replace fluorescent lamps. There's a lot of, fear, uncertainty, and doubt around that says that, these LED UV don't produce the same thing as fluorescent lamps. John Courtney Smith of Arcadia, of course, has said that these are a failed tech. But of course, he wants to sell lamps because they have warehouses full of halogen bulbs and fluorescent lamps and big contracts with these companies. And an example of a big contract with companies is if you go over to your PetSmart, you will actually find fluorescent lamps inside of the PetSmart brand Thrive box that are Arcadia fluorescent lamps. Arcadia has no problem making big business contracts that do not align with anything that ethical keepers actually believe. However, they've managed to trick those ethical keepers into believing that Arcadia is somehow special and more ethical, which is just hysterical. But back on point, the pressure of using things like fluorescent lamps, as well as using things like incandescent lamps, is that they require a lot of power. That power, of course, in many places in the US is provided by coal plants. Now, I'm not trying to get into a tree hugger kind of vector with this, but this is actually factual information. The increased amount of coal power that we use causes all sorts of pollution that everybody's familiar with. Not only that, but these lamps have to be replaced pretty often, and the manufacturing process for those lamps is pretty intense. So the pressure of the reptile hobby claiming that they are not ready to shift over to technologies like LED UVs or quartz heaters, or even, it would be pretty trivial for somebody that had multiple cages to actually make a water cooling and heating system that would have radiators inside of the individual cages, and then you can tweak, rows of cages or individual cages so that they're cooler and warmer. That solves so many problems and is more than likely more efficient than the halogen bulbs and DHPs that you're trying to use. So the short version of this is no, the US government is not trying to stop us from keeping reptiles because they won't let us use halogens. The US government is not trying to stop people from using reptiles because if they were getting rid of 100-year-old technology. The fact is that the reptile hobby continues to cling onto old, antiquated things like it's a 1965 Mustang. This technology is old, outdated, cheap to go ahead and rebox, which is exactly why Arcadia exists. And it is outdated, and we should have shifted to things that were better a long time ago. A long time ago. Just as an example of some of these items, I'll go back over to the silicone heat mats here. These are used safely throughout many industries to provide heat. This can be used to provide an ambient heat. Now, again, a lot of people will say, well, it doesn't work very well for ambient heat. If you get a large enough silicone heat mat, it absolutely will. However, most people are using a silicone heat mat, and they're sticking it to something like PVC, which has bad energy transfer. So that's obviously not going to work all that well. The alternative, of course, is that a lot of people also use things like FlexWatt tape. This was originally used to heat bathroom floors. I want to keep, to make sure that you all understand that this isn't a purpose-built specific product that was created for reptile keepers. This was reused as something that was used to heat bathroom floors. You're using a technology used to heat bathroom floors from years ago in order to warm your reptiles. And of course, this has all the exact same faults as a silicone heat mat. However, FlexWatt tape is even less safe than a silicone heat mat. So strangely enough, the reptile hobby will not use silicone heat mats, but they'll use antiquated FlexWatt tape. Mind-blowing. The reptile hobby will not shift over and help to develop things like LED UV. Arcadia is not putting money into LED UV. Companies like VivTech at least sprung off on the LED UV, where we can iterate on these products and make them better. Arcadia's just raw grip on something so antiquated and so inefficient, and just something that should not really be a focus of a company in 2024, is something that is absolutely hilarious. The absolute iron grip. I think I saw Nerd, good old Donnie, made a reaction video to this, and the absolute iron grip to this old antiquated crap is illustrated throughout that video. We have alternatives. We've had alternatives for years, and we refuse to use them, either because we believed in the cost or because we just wanted to emulate what somebody else was doing. So if somebody wants to emulate what Nerd is doing, of course they're not going to go out and try to make a radiator for a water cooled system. They're not going to go out and try to do anything that Nerd doesn't do. So Nerd, of course, is light bulbs and heat tape. The average keeper is light bulbs and heat tape. This is stuff that we don't need anymore. In fact, because of things like the light bulb considerations in multiple countries, we don't need any of this technology anymore at all. We need to move over to things like LEDs. We need to move over to things like quartz heaters. We need to move over to reusing like massage parlor infrared treatment lamps or whatever it is, and move away from cheap halogen bulbs with a high markup that we promise are more ethical than other light bulb sources. The reptile hobby is bad. I'm sorry, but the reptile hobby is bad, and this is just another example. Let go of the antiquated technology that companies are getting for cheap, selling to you at a high markup, that are completely inefficient, raising the pressure for you to keep actually ethically or keep in line with animal science, because running them and replacing them is expensive. And move to technologies that are available in the current decade. Please, please. Leave in the comments your own ridiculous rants about how something like silicone mats aren't efficient and explode, and all of these other myths that don't make any sense. Again, the reptile hobby is the only one that has trouble with silicone mats exploding. Inherently, silicone mats do swell, but the reptile hobby should know well enough to monitor those mats. We should have something in place where we would be able to, notice when these things are damaged. We need to have something in place where we show people how to use these correctly, because it is a safe technology and you can actually raise ambient temperature. If you don't believe me, then go stick a silicone mat to a Tupperware dish and stick a thermometer in there. For some reason, other animal science industries and other industries in general do not have the same problem as the reptile hobby. Very strange. Celebrate the fact that we're phasing out these things and putting pressure on companies like Arcadia to move away from 100-year-old technologies. Celebrate that. And be happy that this will force the reptile hobby into a new age. Technology has already influenced a ton of the reptile hobby just right now. If you've watched this channel, which I don't know why you would, but if you did watch this channel, then you would know that there was an experiment that I did in my own kitchen that actually did gene testing for snakes. This was before a lot of people started doing this. I think I was pretty early. I did this all with Mini PCR equipment. Mini PCR is a great company. This reduced pressure inside of the reptile hobby again. If you can go to a company like RGI or Rare Genetics and have them test for something like a het gene, that means that you don't have to sit there and prove out a whole bunch of what you believe are het 66 or het 33, which is ridiculous. You don't have to do that. So it reduces overproduction pressure. This is definitely what would be ethical if that term meant anything in the hobby. The pressure to move away from incandescent lamps and move over to something that, again, is something that was used in this decade is absolutely a good thing and aligns directly with adopting technology, even technology like gene testing, in the reptile hobby.